Hello everyone, this is Jeremy. I'm at the Cessnon House kitchen on Cabrillo College's campus, and I'm just going to do a short demo here introducing making a bread dough, in this case making focaccia. So I've got a few things that are set up already, and I'm going to kind of move my camera around here so you can see them. So this is a Hobart 20-quart mixer here. And inside the mixer, I've got 10 pounds of flour and 3 ounces of instant yeast. They're mixed together in there already. Instant yeast you could add directly into flour when you're making doughs. If you use active dry yeast, good idea to hydrate it first with something sweet to make sure it's active, so you can kind of test the yeast. Instant yeast is a little kind of easier to use. And then I've also got over here, I've got some salt, I think it's 2.9 ounces, sugar 8 ounces, and a little over 9 ounces of extra virgin olive oil, and then 120 ounces of water. And that 120 ounces is 7.5 pounds, and that makes the hydration rate of this dough 75%. And most bread doughs are going to be somewhere between 60 to 80% hydration, depending on what type of dough you're making. So focaccia is a very wet dough that's spread out in a pan, which we'll see in a later video. And then baked that way, so you end up with this relatively thin bread, so it's a very high hydration dough. Other doughs that are formed and shaped like loaves or baguettes or something like that, those are going to have a lower hydration rate than something like focaccia. So basically what I'm going to do is we're going to use what's called the straight dough method, which means we just add everything in together basically into the mixer. I've got a dough hook on the mixer, so as opposed to a paddle or a whisk, we're not using those to make a dough. We're using a dough hook, which you can see why it's named what it's named. And the dough hook will work that dough up against the side of the bowl as the dough's mixing. And between that and the hydration, that water that we add to the flour will develop gluten in our dough. And gluten is a number of different types of protein that when they're hydrated, they start to align and have bonding between them. You can kind of think of them as like rubber bands almost interacting with each other, and that gives the dough the ability to stretch and ultimately to trap air in it as it's baking, or actually carbon dioxide in it as it's baking, from the activity of the yeast. So the yeast is going to consume sugars and produce carbon dioxide, and that's a gas, and that's what leavens and gives lightness to yeast leavened breads. And so that's basically, we'll mix this dough, make sure we develop the gluten properly on it, make sure the hydration is right. Flour gluten contents or protein contents vary quite a bit, and so we always want to do some assessment about the hydration of the dough when we're making them. And then once we've developed the dough properly, I'm going to proof it in a proof box, and then I will shape it. So in this case of focaccia, I'll scale it and shape it. So I'll be weighing the dough, putting them into half sheet pans, and then it's called stippling with focaccia, which is when you spread it out by hand, which is why focaccia kind of has that uneven texture to it. It's not rolled with a rolling pin or something. And then proofed again, and then it's baked. So this video, I'm just going to show you making the dough. So again, I've got that the flour and yeast in there. I'm going to start up my mixer here and lift it. and just to blend together that flour and yeast evenly. One thing about yeast is it's sensitive to salt, so we don't want to add salt directly to yeast because you can kill it basically. And so I'm going to stop the mixer here for a second, and I'll go ahead and add in all this water, and then I'm going to also add in the olive oil and the sugar. So again, straight dough method, we just add everything in together. The one thing I will sift in as it's running is the salt, so that I don't just dump it straight on somewhere that might have a fair amount of yeast. So I'm going to jog this a little bit because this is a pretty large batch of this dough for this mixer. This is a 20-quart Hobart mixer. So I'll jog it a little bit to start incorporating those liquids in. And then once I see it's safe for me to leave it on without spraying flour all over myself, then I'll go ahead and sift in that salt as it's running. And we're going to let this run and let it form a dough ball. And focaccia, again, because it's a high hydration dough, we would expect that it's sticking to the side of the bowl, but that it comes off clean. So you can tell right now with what we're seeing in the bowl there, it's sticking to the side, but it's also not forming a clean dough yet. So we'll want to let it mix for a little bit because it takes a bit for the flour to hydrate. It might not need more flour, but it may need a little bit more flour. So we'll see. And then once I get the hydration adjusted correctly, then I'm going to, at that point, then I just let it mix out to develop the gluten. And I'll point that out in a later video about what you want to look for to ensure that you have the proper gluten development. So this dough looks pretty wet, and I am going to set this down for a moment so I can get some more flour. And I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit more flour in here. So again, because flour varies quite a bit in protein content, it's not uncommon that you need to make some adjustments to doughs. And again, the gluten content of different flours vary fairly significantly. So bread flour has the highest amount of gluten, all-purpose flour a little bit less, and then if you're using pastry or cake flours, they have a lot less. So we would use either bread or AP for making a dough like this. So in the end, we should have a wet dough that's kind of balling but sticking to the sides of the bowl as it's mixing, but it should clean off the bowl okay. So that's what I'm kind of looking for, is that it starts to pull that dough off the side of the bowl here. Some focaccias, I probably could leave it this hydrated. I've worked with chefs before, pastry chefs before, that make focaccias that are almost pourable. So again, they're one of the more high hydration doughs, and because we're not looking for them to hold their shape when they're put into pans, or we're not trying to make a loaf shape or something like that, they are oftentimes wetter. I'm going to put a little bit more flour in, and I may leave it that it's still a little bit on the wet side. So once I've got it, you know, the hydration the way I want it on it, then I'm gonna mix it until I can take some dough and stretch it out and it doesn't tear before it can get very thin. It's often called the window method of testing a dough. And I'm gonna take some of it out of here in just a second and show you what it looks like now. It definitely needs more mixing. Most doughs, typically it's gonna take about 10 minutes or so on a mixer like this in order to develop that gluten fully. So let me reset this and I'll show you that assessment of whether the dough's developed or not. So we would expect right now it's not, it's only been mixing for a minute or so. So if I take this dough, and it's very sticky, I'll coat it in some flour so I can handle it. And if I just take this and I spread it out, and then I go to stretch it, you can see this tears very easily. It doesn't stretch and hold together. The window method, we'd expect that dough will stretch out. It gets very thin and you almost see some webbing inside of that thin section of the dough. And that's an indicator that we've developed the gluten enough. When the dough just stretches and rips very easily, or if we're making a tighter dough, it might be difficult to stretch because it's tighter. When I say that, I mean it has less water in it. Then in that case, it may resist a lot, and then we end up tearing it before you can get it very thin. Again, both of those are indicators that it's not developed enough, that we need to develop that gluten more. So I'm going to mix this dough out when I have it mixed out, so you're not just watching a video of the mixer mixing for 8 minutes or whatever. I'll show you again what that dough looks like when it's properly developed, and then I'll be proofing it. So stay tuned for another video.